It's October 23rd. This is the second episode of the 36Exposures Photography Podcast. We're going to talk about Lightroom. We got five 50mm lenses under $65 that you can find pretty cheap, pretty easy. And let's get this thing started. So Adobe had Adobe Max going on last week. They announced that they're going to kill off standalone Lightroom. So no more purchasing the desktop version at your local Best Buy or wherever you'd purchase software on a CD. Hardly anybody does that anymore, so it makes sense. So the main thing that I've always had problems with Lightroom is the speed. I found ways to mitigate it, but now that it's greatly improved, it's a lot faster. The version that is replacing Lightroom 6 is Lightroom Classic CC. It's included with your $9.95 a month subscription fee with Photoshop, along with Lightroom CC, which is the new version. Now the main differences are the classic version is essentially the same as Lightroom 6. It's desktop, sorts your photos on your hard drive, on your computer, wherever you have them stored. Mainly it's a lot quicker, so its main problem has been taken care of. With Lightroom CC, everything is cloud-based. So you can upload everything, which, depending on your file size, might take a while. This is one of those things I haven't tried it out yet. So for the $9.95 plan or $9.99 plan, you get 20 gigabytes of space. If you're using something newer like a Nikon D850, you're going to have 100 megabyte files. So that'll fill that up fairly quickly if you shoot frequently. The plus side of the whole cloud thing is you can pull up all your photos on your phone, your tablet, at any location, anywhere. So I assume that it edits the previews and then you can, download the full versions later. So I haven't tried it out. I'm not 100% sure on how that's going to work. The main thing for me, I don't really need that. It might be helpful to have a few photos up there that I can mess around with, or if I'm out somewhere, I can upload them through Wi-Fi on my phone. So that, that's a possibility. Generally, if I wouldn't see the need to upgrade to the 1 terabyte plan for me, but if you're a very mobile photographer, it might be a solid option for you to use. I'm sticking with the Lightroom Classic CC just for the speed improvements. Now, my professional work, I don't use Lightroom. I work for a company, and that company has a very specific workflow server with very specific software that they wrote to edit and process the photos, and their own capture tether points. So most of the time, I spend 5 days a week using that. On my freelance stuff or, artsy-fartsy things, I'll still be using Lightroom at home, mostly for the cataloging. Ideally, most of the stuff I get right in camera, I'd like to think, or at least what I'm looking for. Using the Fuji, I tend to use JPEG straight out of camera, using certain, film simulation settings depending on where I'm going. I did that a lot on my trip to Cuba. I picked out basically with the film simulation, you can pick out a couple different options. Depending on what neighborhood I was in and what color the house is, I do a black and white with a red, green, or yellow filter. And then I'd have my Velvia, which is very saturated, bright colors. And then I use one of the pro simulations for the film for pictures of people. So it's very simple. The JPEGs are really great out of camera, so I don't have to fuss with it too much. If anything had a lot of shadows and a lot of highlights, you just switch it over to the normal RAW plus JPEG, so you get that little extra dynamic range in the RAW. But generally, with that, it's straight out of camera. And so I don't really have to do too much. It's more just cataloging the photos, basic edits, resizing, exporting, things like that. So Lightroom Classic works for me, but the new Lightroom CC might work a lot better for you, depending on what your workflow is. So we have our 5 cameras and 5 lenses over here. Like I said, I use the 80D with different adapters and no adapter on one of them. So up on the screen here, I have a comparison image. I'll be popping that up so you can see that. It'll also be on the blog for the episode as well, along with a few other photos that we'll get to. So to start off, we have our standard Canon 1.8 Mark II 50mm, super cheap on eBay. You can get these $65 and under. The newer versions with STM, they're really nice. They're a little bit more, around 100, 125 used, but they're, fairly solid overall. The second lens that we have in the comparison chart is the Canon FD 5014 SSC. It's got fancy coatings, all that stuff. One of the higher end pre-L lenses for Canon. Then we have two different versions of the Minolta 50mm 1.7. Now, ideally, you'd think they'd be very similar, but we'll get to it. There's quite a big difference between the two in one particular respect. Now, then we have the ever popular Super Takumar 55 1.8. That's an M42 screw mount, so that works on any camera that's got that mount. Then we have the Russian Zeiss clone, the Helios 44-2, the 58 2.0, a very interesting lens. So on the chart, our first comparisons, we have the 50mm 1.8 Mark II. Overall, it's probably the sharpest lens of the bunch. I mean, you have to face facts. Despite what some people might say on the internet, newer lenses are much sharper and better at rendering color than old lenses. They're sharper from center to edge. They tend to be less distorted. And you can see the difference in these comparisons, but they tend to feel a little bit more clinical, which is why I like in the 50mm range to use one of these other lenses. They feel a little bit warmer, a little bit more organic. The problem with newer lenses is when it comes to artistic choices, you have to change things in post-production later. They very accurately represent real color. If that's not something you're looking for that photo, then you have to do it afterwards. It takes more time. When I'm shooting for myself, I don't want that clinical reproduction of color. I want some style to it. I don't want to spend a bunch of time messing around with sliders and dials and clicking buttons and comparing it on different monitors. I want to take the photo and have it have a certain look, and using these different lenses is something that I can get. Now, the second one in the chart is the Canon 50mm 1.4 SSC. Now, this lens is pretty sharp. The colors feel like they're brighter. Whatever coating is on this, they tend to be a little bit more saturated, at least in my experience on this Canon body. You can see it in the comparison. The only thing I did was slight exposure tweaks in these. So you'll see that at 50mm, all these adapters put them at different zooms. Now this is a APS-C sensor on this camera, so it's going to be a little bit longer of a focal length than the 50mm. Some are closer than others. I mean, there's always a little bit of variation between 50mm. They're not always exact, just about for any lens. They're never really exact. But you can see in the chart, it's a lot more zoomed in, like significantly more. So it seems like it's closer to like 85 than the 50 when it's on the adapter that I have. Some adapters might be different. Like actually with this one, I do have trouble with infinity focusing. It's slightly off. It doesn't quite get there. So this probably has something to do with it. But it is very sharp. The letters on the gravestone, edges of the tiles are brilliant. Now we move on to the two Minolta lenses. Now one of them is the Rokkor X. That's older than the standard one. That's the higher end version of the lens. So in theory it should be a little bit better, but they are both extremely similar. But when it comes to quality and color, they're very similar. Bokeh and these, it's very turbulent. I kind of like the look. It's something that I prefer to use on film than with digital, or at least in black and white. And compared to the Canon 1.4, which is much creamier, which is for obvious reasons. It opens up a little bit more. It's actually very similar to the Canon 1.8 in bokeh shape and style. But you'll see the zoom difference on those two. Now, they're both Minolta 50mm f1.7 lenses on the same adapter on the same camera, but the standard is zoomed in a lot more. Now, this is something I've never noticed using them at different times on different film bodies, but now I'm going to compare them both on the same film body, because it's the same adapter on the same camera, same focal length lens by the same manufacturer. You'd assume it'd be very, very close, but the standard version, the non-Rockor X, seems like it's closer to 75 to 80 as opposed to like what, maybe 65, give or take a bit, on an APS-C sensor. Now the next one is the Super Takumar for Pentax, made by Pentax, on an M42 screw mount. Now if you look up anything on this lens, a lot of Pentax fans really like this lens. The bokeh is very, very smooth. I really enjoy that look on this cam. It's very smooth around the back here. The color is very good. It's a little bit brighter than the Minoltas. And then we move on to the Helios Zeiss clone. Now, if you're looking for a very cheap adaptable lens, these are all over the place. There's several versions of it. There's different focal lengths. They're really great cheap lenses. It's out of the 5 that I tested today, for the photos that I took today, this is probably my favorite of the bunch. Now, it's very sharp, sharper than you'd expect for a very cheap Russian clone. Edges of the tile are great, the colors are strong. The bokeh is sort of in between the Super Takumar and the Minolta Rockor X. It's not quite as smooth as the Takumar, it's not quite as turbulent as the Minolta, but it has a really nice quality to it. It's a little bit longer in the focal length at 58, but if you see by the comparison on the adapter, it's actually very similar to the 55 or the Minolta 50. It's a little bit closer to those. Now we go on to the next little photo here. I found a beautiful angel statue. Now, I'll throw this photo up on the screen as well. You can also see it in the blog if you're just listening to the audio. This test shot was shot with a Canon 1.8 Mark II 50mm lens. As you can see, the background's really ugly. There's a weird steel frame, there's a wire fence, there's an ugly, ugly palm tree that I can't stand. I'm not a fan of palm trees. But I really like those little angel statues. So, we'll do a few photos to mitigate the background so you can really see the difference between this one shot at f16 and then the other ones shot at their wide open apertures varying between 1.4 and 2.0. The first one up would be the Canon. Same one as the last one, but stopped down to 1.8. You get a really good shallow depth of field. The background blurs very nicely, but you can still sort of see the ugly rusty brown colors compared to the green. Probably look a lot better in black and white, but I just wanted to do a comparison. Now we move on to the Canon SSC f1.4. Beautiful creamy background, everything smudges together gorgeously. I was a little off on my focus, but it's really tough to manually focus without a split prism finder or something with like the Fujis. They have a great live view and you can zoom in, focus peaking. A lot of different mirrorless cameras have that. Or if you have Magic Lantern, you can kind of do that on some other cameras, like the T3i I got right over there. Now we get to the two Minolta lenses, I believe. No, I lied. This is the Helios. Now, there's a very particular way that I can tell this lens when I actually look at the photo, is that the bokeh kind of swirls around. It's very characteristic of this lens. It sort of gets, it's nice, blurry, but it seems like it has a directional turn to it around the outside edges. Then we move on to the Minoltas. Now this is another example of how you can see the difference in the same focal length lens actually being a different focal length than the other. Now, on the monitor you can see it here. It's very zoomed in on the face. It's not as blurred out as the other lenses at the wide open aperture. Now the 1.8 was very soft. The 1.4 was super soft. This is 1.7. You'd think it'd be a little bit softer than that, but like I was saying, it's a little turbulent. I really like that look on certain photos. If this was black and white on film, depending on what type of grain it's going to have a really crosshatchy sort of paint look to it, which I really enjoy. And then if you go to the Rokkor X version, you can see the difference in focal length. But it has slightly smoother in the background, but it's very similar kind of look. It's got the crosshatchy up, down, left, right kind of deal. Then we go last but not least, the Pentax Super Takumar 1.8 at the 55 millimeters. Now, I really liked this photo for this lens. This makes it kind of lend itself towards portraits. It'd be something that I'm going to try this with. I haven't really used it too much on the digital body. But you can see it's fairly sharp in the center, but the background is gorgeously smoothed out. Everything blends together great. And we're looking at, for these lenses, like I said, under $65 for each. Now the Canon's around $65. Like I said, you can get the newer ones for $125. The Minoltas vary between $20 and $60, depending on which version, what condition. The Canon SSC, that tends to be a little bit on the higher end as well. A little bit more towards 60, 65. You can get it cheaper. I got this one for much less than that. It was free. Same thing with the Super Takumar that runs, 35, 40. And the Helios can run anywhere from $10 to $50, depending on who is selling it. A lot of times they're coming from Russia or Ukraine. So the lenses itself are fairly cheap, 25, 27, 30, depending on which one you go with. Some are a little more, but you're looking at higher shipping costs, so it pushes it up there. Now all of these, particularly, I didn't buy separately. They came with cameras, so that's a brilliant bonus that you can get, is that I did buy this Mark II Canon brand new when it came out. It's been around quite a few years. I bought that at, I believe, $89. That was quite a few years ago. It's a little struggling in the focus. I don't really use it too much. I tend to use like the 24 to 70 or the 70 to 200 more often. For portrait length for me, I tend to lean towards the 70 to 200 more often. I like the more compressed look. I like to be a little farther back, get that separation. But it's been a tank, and you can't really go wrong with it. With the two Minolta lenses, they both came on cameras that I bought. The Rokkor X came on an X700, and the other came on an X370. Both of those cameras I purchased for under $50. If you can get, it's basically like buying the lens with a camera attached or vice versa. You can get some really good deals. Now with the Helios, particularly, I was at an estate sale and saw a box of a camera that said Delta 1. I've never heard of Delta cameras at all, and I collect cameras. I have quite a few. I didn't bother doing any research, check out what it was. I just gave them the $10, took it with me, went about my business. When I got home, pulled it out of the box and checked it out. There was a little nameplate on there, glued onto the thing that said Delta 1. The camera looked very familiar, and I couldn't quite place exactly what it was until I actually read the text on the lens. It said Helios, so I knew immediately it was going to be a Russian camera. After a little bit of futzing and wiggling, I pulled off the nameplate, I don't know if it'll focus there, but it says Zenit, which some of you may have heard of. They actually have a new camera body in the works. There's supposedly a Zenit digital camera reviving the brand that's rumored to be a Leica rebadged or remodeled as a Zenit, which is very interesting and very cool. But maybe that'll open the door to maybe a screw mount mirrorless. That'd be brilliant. But it probably won't happen. With the Pentax, it was the same thing. I got this camera for $20. It came with the lens. Camera works brilliantly, and you need a battery for the meter, but overall, like, you don't. With the Canon F1, I talked about this briefly on the last episode. My brother gave it to me on our road trip. I shot a bunch of film on the way back with it, with this lens on it. So, like, the lens, I believe, came with a Canon A1 I bought a few years ago. I bought two A1s, or an AE1 program, and a bunch of lenses in a bag at a Salvation Army for $100. There was like 6 lenses, 2 bodies, a ton of accessories, a really nice bag. So the actual cost per part was essentially nothing, considering how much stuff was actually in there. But if you buy them individually on their own, you know, they're fairly cheap. Sometimes you can just get a brilliant working camera with it. And these adapters you can get on eBay. I buy them from Photodiox or Diox. I'm not sure how to say that. Everybody seems to say it a little bit different. But like I said, I have a couple different adapters. Now, with the Canon FD, the adapter I have doesn't have glass in it. So it, like I said, doesn't infinity focus. Now, Canon cameras are, for DSLR cameras, they're more adaptable than other cameras just because of the flange to mirror distance, I believe is what it is. Or mirrorless cameras are even better. Now, like for the M42s, I have 2 different adapters. I have one that allows for infinity focus and one that's spaced out to use them as a macro lens. So it gives me more options. It can make for some really cool looks because how blurry and swirly the Helios gets. It's fun to get in flowers. Nothing amazing comes out of it for me, but it's fun to play with and be creative with. And then with the Minolta lenses, I have 2 different adapters as well. One with glass for infinity focus and one without glass. The one without glass tends to look a little bit better on color and sharpness, but you lose the infinity focus. So I tend to use that one if I use them for videos, and then for still photos I tend to use one with the glass, and I can punch up the colors and sharpness a little bit later if I have to. I think that just about does it for our lens shootout, but I will say my personal pick out of these for the photos, the type of photos that I did today, would probably be the Pentax. Overall, it tends to do better. But like I mentioned, they all have specific purposes that I use them for, and you can get creative with these things for really cheap. And then, but it's a rabbit hole. Once you start going for different focal lengths. You find the rare lenses; they tend to get up there in price. So just watch yourself with the gas. It can get up there. Our last little segment today, I'm going to talk a little bit about this pyramid of film behind me. So, like I've been mentioning, we've went on a road trip. And I took a bunch of film shots with a couple different Canons. My kids took their Rebels. They shot a couple rolls of film as well. Damn it, I forgot something. Let me just go over here, grab that stupid thing, open to everything as I walk by. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of bulk roll film, which, you know, you roll your own, you load it up, and put it into cartridges and turn the little handle. It goes clicky, 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 and you get some exposures. We'll do a quick little video on that in the future. But what I have here is a couple hand-rolled rolls of film. It's Kodak 5293, which is EXR 35mm movie film, and it's 200 ISO tungsten balanced. So that means a couple different things for those who don't know. A lot of cool movies were shot on this film. Kill Bill 2, a bunch of other Oscar-winning movies. I'll post some links up. It has a really cool look to it. But, like I said, there's a couple different issues. They have... The film has a backing on it to help it so while it's moving through film cameras for movies, it doesn't get all scratched up. It's referred to as remjet, and it's kind of like this black carbon stuff. You can see on the film it is very, very black. Usually when you look at your film, it tends to be a little, more brownish. If it's color, if it's black and white, it can vary a little bit. But that's something that has to be removed during development. Now there are a few places that will develop. Your ECN2, which is the film process used for this 35mm motion picture film. You can cross-process it in C41. Like I said, you have to remove the backing in some way or another. So now, a lot of places that process ECN2 have a minimum amount because it's movie film. It tends to be on really long rolls. I have a couple cans of this film and some daylight film that are 2,000 feet each. So there's usually a minimum to get it processed. And if you're just shooting still film, it's going to take quite a few rolls to meet those minimums. But if you do some Google searching, there are some places that do it. Now, if you send it to those places, you want to make sure it's clearly labeled, because if you bring it somewhere else that runs it through a machine, that black backing is going to destroy all the chemicals and mess up all kinds of people's film, and people aren't going to be happy, and they're not going to want you as a return customer. But there's a couple other things that you can do with this as well. So since it's tungsten balanced, if you're not lighting with tungsten lights, your white balance is going to be a little off. But you can use that creatively in certain ways. If you shoot at sunset or sunrise, you can get a very specific look to your photos. Or if you're shooting out, if you want a nice cool look, it's going to give you that if you shoot in daylight. But if you do shoot in daylight and you want it to look right, you're going to want to put a filter in front of it. Now, an 85B filter, as you can see, I put it in front of my face, it's very, very warming. Now if I put it up to the camera, you can see quite the difference here because I'm using fixed white balance, so it's not going to automatically change and mess it up. Now if you put the filter on it, it's going to drop the exposure or the ISO to about 125 as opposed to 200. Like I said, you can use it creatively either way. You can get these filters fairly cheap. If you like, this one's just a ProMaster. It's glass, but it's not the greatest. But it depends on what you're using it for it to really matter. And that cost me under $20. You can get gel filters and just kind of put it in front of your lens. Or if you're using like a matte box or something, you can put it over that. And you can also leave it without the filter. And then if you get your film scanned, you can adjust it digitally later and you'll be alright. But back to the remjets. You can remove that at home yourself. It's fairly easy. You just take some sodium bicarbonate and water, put it in there, shake it up, dump it out. It only takes a couple minutes. I'll do a video on that just so you can see the mess that I make. I've failed before and I'm sure I'll fail again, but it's still fun. So I've probably shot like 4 or 5 rolls of this while I was on my road trip. I'm excited to see the results. I haven't got around to it yet. But I was thinking of doing something. I haven't sorted it out yet, but I'm going to do a giveaway of this film. Because like I said, I have a few thousand feet of it and a few hundred rolls ready to go. So I'll set something up in the future, maybe just have some sort of contest of some kind just to get it out there and so people can have some fun and share their pictures with us and with everyone. I guess that'll do it for this week. We'll get a little more in-depth about something next week. I'm not sure what it is. It depends on what happens. Thanks for listening and or watching if the video turned out okay.